Have you ever stopped to consider the silent ghosts that haunt the pages of fashion history? Not trends that have died, but powerful figures who have been erased from their own stories. When we think of the giants of 20th century fashion, one name springs to mind: Diana Vreeland, a maverick prophet, a priestess of vanity whose legacy is etched in stone. But what if the real power, the power to shape the fate of an entire industry, had not been in her hands? What if it had belonged to another woman, someone with the same profound substance, quiet authority, and profound influence as Vreeland so loudly and dramatically embodied? Her name? Bettina Ballard. How did the woman who was a confidant of Dior and Balenciaga, the undisputed queen of post-war Parisian fashion, become a footnote in the very history she helped write? And what does her forgotten reign reveal about the never-ending battle between quiet substance and glamour, a battle that continues to shape our culture today? To understand the quiet authority that Bettina Ballard would one day wield, you first have to understand the world that she didn't quite fit into. She was born Bettina Instone in 1905 into a world of comfortable East Coast American privilege. This was the tail end of the Gilded Age, a society where one's family name and social connections were the primary currency. Her upbringing was one of refined upper-class propriety, private schools, summers in the country, and the carefully orchestrated rituals of high society. She was intelligent, well-read, and possessed an innate sense of classic, understated style. Her destiny, as far as her family and her class were concerned, was clear and narrow. She would be a debutante, she would be presented to society, and she would make a suitable marriage to a man of similar background, thereafter presiding over a well-run household and dedicating her life to her husband and children. And for a time, Bettina followed the script perfectly. She made her debut, she charmed the right people, and she married a handsome young man from a good family named Shreve Ballard. On paper, it was the perfect match, the culmination of everything her upbringing had prepared her for. Her future seemed to stretch out before her, a long, placid, and predictable avenue of garden parties, charity committees, and domestic tranquility. But within this well-mannered, conventional young woman, there was a restless spirit, a sharp, analytical mind that was starved for something more than the polite, repetitive conversations of the society drawing room. The marriage, so promising on the surface, quickly withered from a lack of any real shared passion or intellectual connection. It ended in a quiet, civilized divorce. And suddenly, Bettina Ballard was adrift. In the late 1920s, to be a young divorcee, even in the most sophisticated circles, was to be an object of mild scandal and pity. She was a woman without a defined role. She had failed at the one job society had assigned her. It was this failure, this moment of being untethered from her expected path, that would paradoxically become the catalyst for her extraordinary life. She needed a job, not just for financial independence, but for a sense of purpose, for an identity that was entirely her own. This was the era of the new woman, a time of profound social change. The Great War had not only shattered a generation of men, but had also fractured the old social order. Women had tasted independence, and the world of work, once closed to those of Bettina's class, was slowly beginning to open. For a well-bred, stylish young woman, the options were still limited: art galleries, interior decorating, and, most glamorously of all, the burgeoning world of the fashion magazine. In the 1920s and 30s, magazines like Vogue and Harper's Bazaar were undergoing a magnificent transformation. They were evolving from simple society journals into sophisticated Bibles of style, taste, and modern living. They were at the very forefront of culture, commissioning work from the greatest artists, photographers, and writers of the age, from Man Ray and Cecil Beaton to Cocteau and Hemingway. And they were ruled by a series of formidable, often terrifying, female editors who were the absolute arbiters of elegance for the entire Western world. At the absolute pinnacle of this empire of taste was the publishing house of Condé Nast. Nast was a visionary who understood that a magazine could be a luxury product in itself. His flagship, American Vogue, was a testament to this belief, and the woman he entrusted to execute his vision, the undisputed empress of the entire operation, was a woman of iron will and unshakable standards named Edna Woolman Chase. Mrs. Chase was a legend and a terror. She had started at Vogue in 1895 as a clerk in the circulation department and had, through sheer talent and relentless hard work, risen to become the editor-in-chief, a position she would hold for nearly 40 years. She was a stern Quaker-raised perfectionist who demanded nothing less than total flawless dedication from her staff. She was famous for her desk-side critiques that could reduce a young editor to tears, and for her absolute faith in the gospel of good taste. It was into this high-pressure, high-stakes world that Bettina Ballard, armed with a few good social connections and a desperate need for a new life, landed a job in 1926. Her initial role was far from the glamorous image one might have of Vogue. As she later wrote in her brilliant, witty, and deeply insightful memoir, In My Fashion, she was a junior editor, a glorified secretary, a general mouse. Her days were spent writing captions for products, answering phones, running errands, and generally trying to stay out of the way of the more senior and more fearsome editors. She was not, by her own admission, a natural, not in the way her future rival was. Diana Vreeland, who around this same time was making her explosive debut at the rival magazine, Harper's Bazaar, was a born fantasist. She was a creature of pure, instinctual style, a woman who seemed to have been born with a fully formed, eccentric, and utterly original vision. Vreeland didn't need to learn fashion. She was fashion. Bettina was different. She was quieter, more observant, more analytical. She was a student, and Vogue, under the terrifying but brilliant tutelage of Mrs. Chase, was the greatest and most demanding school of fashion in the world. Bettina learned by watching and by listening. She describes these early years with a mixture of terror and awe. She was working alongside a group of brilliant, stylish, and often ruthless women, giants of the industry, like Carmel Snow, the legendary editor who would later defect to Harper's Bazaar and become Mrs. Chase's greatest rival. Bettina studied how these women worked. She watched how a great editor could take a simple photograph of a dress and, through the alchemy of layout, cropping, and the perfect pithy caption, transform it into a statement of timeless elegance. She learned the complex, delicate diplomacy required to navigate the competing egos of powerful advertisers, temperamental photographers, and the wealthy society women who were the magazine's lifeblood. Most importantly, she absorbed the Vogue philosophy, as dictated by the high priestess, Mrs. Chase. It was a philosophy built on a foundation of good taste. This wasn't a vague or subjective concept for Mrs. Chase. It was a rigid, almost moral code. It was not about fleeting trends or wild theatrical fantasy. It was about quality, craftsmanship, elegance, and a kind of wearable, intelligent style that was aspirational but never absurd. It was about teaching women how to live beautifully and thoughtfully. It was a vision of fashion as a form of applied intelligence, a vision that resonated deeply with Bettina's own innate classicism and sharp analytical mind. She was a quick study. Her quiet competence, her refined taste, and her ability to learn quickly did not go unnoticed. Mrs. Chase, a woman who valued professionalism and hard work above all else, began to see the potential in the serious, well-bred young divorcee. Bettina was promoted, given more responsibility. She began to find her own voice, her own confidence. She had survived the trial by fire of the New York office. And then she was given the assignment that would change her life, the move that would take her from being a student to becoming a master. In the mid-1930s, she was transferred to the Paris office of Vogue. She was going to the heart of the empire, the city where fashion was not just reported on, but born. If New York Vogue was the powerful, business-minded head of the fashion world, pre-war Paris Vogue was its creative beating heart. To be posted there was to be sent to the absolute epicenter of style, the source from which all trends flowed. The Paris of the 1930s was a city at the zenith of its creative power, a dazzling constellation of artistic and literary genius. And at the center of this universe was the rarefied, almost sacred world of haute couture. The great couturiers of the era were not just dressmakers. They were figures of immense cultural importance, artists whose work shaped the very silhouette of modern life. It was a world ruled by a pantheon of deities, each with their own distinct religion of style. There was the great modernist, Coco Chanel, who had stripped away ornament and invented the very idea of casual, comfortable chic. There was her great rival, the flamboyant and witty Elsa Schiaparelli, a true surrealist who collaborated with artists like Salvador Dali and Jean Cocteau to create fashion that was shocking, intellectual, and deeply artistic. There were the masters of classic romantic elegance like Jean Patou and Lucien Lelong, and there were the rising stars like the mysterious, almost monastic Spanish genius, Cristobal Balenciaga, a designer's designer whose work was revered by his peers with a kind of religious awe. The twice-yearly couture collections were the most important events on the city's cultural calendar. The entire fashion world revolved around these shows. For a few intense weeks, buyers, journalists, and society figures from all over the world would descend on Paris, flocking to the gilded, mirrored salons of the great houses. The atmosphere was one of hushed reverence, intense competition, and high-stakes drama. Bettina Ballard's new role as fashion editor of Paris Vogue was to be the chief correspondent from this sacred world. Her job was to attend every single collection, to sit on the small gilt chairs for hours, watching as the models glided past. She had to identify the most important new ideas, the subtle shifts in silhouette, the key looks that would define the coming season. And then she had to translate this often arcane world for the millions of readers of American Vogue, to tell them not just what to wear, but how to think about style. It was a role she was born to play. The Parisian emphasis on quality, craftsmanship, and a deep historical understanding of elegance suited her perfectly. She thrived. She quickly developed an encyclopedic knowledge of the industry, but more importantly, she cultivated deep, genuine, personal relationships with the great couturiers. This was her unique and powerful talent. In a world of intimidating Dragon Lady editors, Bettina was different. She was calm, intelligent, and empathetic. She approached the designers not as a cynical journalist looking for a scoop, but as a respectful and knowledgeable collaborator. They in turn trusted her. They saw her as a friend, a confidant, a woman who truly understood and appreciated the artistry and the immense labor that went into their work. She became particularly close with the reclusive and notoriously difficult Cristobal Balenciaga. Balenciaga was a man who despised the press and rarely spoke to journalists. He was a purist, a kind of high priest of cloth who believed his work should speak for itself. While other editors were terrified of his legendary silences and his withering stare, Bettina developed a warm and enduring friendship with him. They would have long, quiet conversations, not about trends, but about the very philosophy of dressmaking, the perfect cut of a sleeve, the precise weight and fall of a particular fabric. It was a meeting of two minds who shared a belief in a kind of pure, unadorned, architectural perfection. Life in pre-war Paris was an intoxicating dream of glamour, art, and creativity. Bettina lived in a chic apartment on the Quai Voltaire, her windows looking out over the Seine. Her days were spent in the gilded salons of the couture houses, in the studios of great photographers like Horst P. Horst and George Hoeningen. Her evenings were spent at dazzling parties, surrounded by a glittering circle of artists, writers, aristocrats, and adventurers. She had found her purpose, her place. She had become a woman of substance and authority in the most sophisticated city in the world. But this idyllic, beautiful world, a world dedicated to the disciplined creation of beauty, was living on borrowed time. The distant, menacing drumbeat of war was growing louder, and the lights of the city of light, the city that had become her spiritual home, were about to be extinguished. When we left Bettina Ballard, she was living an almost impossibly charmed life. As the fashion editor of Paris Vogue, she was at the absolute creative center of the universe, a trusted confidant to the legendary couturiers who dictated global style. She had found her purpose and her power in the city of light. But as the 1930s drew to a close, a long dark shadow began to fall across Europe. The sophisticated, beautiful world that Bettina and her circle had so carefully constructed was becoming increasingly fragile, a bubble of elegance about to be burst by the brutal realities of history. The final years of peace in Paris were lived in a state of surreal, almost hysterical denial. The rise of Nazism in Germany and the increasingly aggressive posture of Hitler were the talk of every political salon, but in the world of haute couture, the primary focus remained on the next collection, the perfect new silhouette. It was a kind of collective willed blindness, a desperate attempt to hold on to beauty in the face of encroaching ugliness. The parties were more lavish, the jewels more brilliant, the laughter a little louder, as if to drown out the sound of marching boots from across the border. Bettina, with her sharp journalistic instincts, was acutely aware of the growing tension. In her memoir, she writes of the strange dual reality of this period. Her days were spent in the hushed, almost sacred atmosphere of the couture houses, discussing the precise placement of a dart with Balenciaga, or the revolutionary use of a new fabric with Chanel. Her evenings were spent at dinner parties, where the conversation would shift dizzyingly from the latest art exhibition to the looming threat of invasion. She was a privileged observer at the end of an era, and she documented the final defiant bursts of creative genius. She watched as Elsa Schiaparelli, ever the provocateur, presented a circus collection of breathtaking witty fantasy, a final joyful explosion of surrealism before the darkness fell. She sat on the gilt chair in Coco Chanel's mirrored salon and saw the master at the height of her powers, creating clothes of such timeless modern elegance that they seemed to exist outside of history. These were more than just clothes. They were acts of cultural defiance, a statement that the spirit of Paris, its dedication to beauty and innovation, would not be easily extinguished. In September 1939, the inevitable happened. War was declared. But the expected apocalypse did not immediately arrive. Instead, France and all of Europe settled into the strange, suspended animation of the drôle de guerre, the phony war. For 8 months, the armies faced each other across the border, but very little happened. In Paris, a semblance of normal life continued, but it was a life lived in a minor key. The city was blacked out at night, men were in uniform, and there was a constant low-level thrum of anxiety. In a remarkable act of cultural resilience, the couture houses even decided to present collections for the spring of 1940. They were sober, practical collections, featuring tailored suits with large pockets for carrying gas masks and wide-shouldered coats that echoed military uniforms. Bettina covered these collections, her dispatches to New York filled with a mixture of professional admiration for the designer's courage and a deep personal sense of foreboding. She, along with the other American journalists and diplomats, was being urged by the U.S. Embassy to leave, but Paris was her home. She couldn't bring herself to abandon it. She waited, as all of Paris waited, for the storm to break. In May of 1940, the storm broke with a speed and ferocity that stunned the world. The Nazi blitzkrieg smashed through the French and British defenses. The supposedly impregnable Maginot Line was bypassed, and the German army poured into France. The French government fled Paris, declaring it an open city to save it from destruction. The city of light was about to be plunged into darkness. For the thousands of foreign nationals, refugees, and anyone considered an enemy of the Reich, it was a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. The order came down from the embassy. All Americans were to evacuate immediately. Bettina's escape from the fall of Paris is a cinematic story of chaos, courage, and the surreal absurdities of war, a narrative she recounts with the cool, observant eye of a seasoned journalist in her memoir. She had to make the heart-wrenching decision of what to pack. In a life filled with beautiful objects, what do you save? She chose a few favorite dresses, her notebooks, and her address book, the key to her entire professional life. She joined the mass exodus, her small car swallowed up in a biblical-scale traffic jam of terrified refugees choking every road leading south out of the city. She describes the scene with a painterly detail. It was a river of humanity, a slow-moving, silent tide of panic. There were magnificent Hispano-Suiza motor cars packed with society ladies and their jewels, stranded next to farmers' carts piled high with furniture and chickens. She writes of the eerie silence, the absence of the normal sounds of traffic. People rarely honked their horns. They sat for hours without moving, united in a state of quiet, communal dread. The only sounds were the crying of children, the occasional distant rumble of artillery, and the terrifying intermittent roar of a German reconnaissance plane flying low overhead, a mechanical hawk surveying the helpless prey below. Amidst the horror, there were moments of black comedy that highlighted the utter strangeness of the situation. Bettina tells the story of finding a friend, a wealthy and famously glamorous society woman, stranded by the side of the road beside her gleaming Rolls-Royce. The woman was in tears. She was accompanied by her maid and her tiny, beribboned Pekingese dog. She had managed to pack a dozen couture gowns and a case of champagne, but in her panic had forgotten to bring any food, water, or petrol. The fundamental absurdity of their privileged lives was laid bare against the stark backdrop of war. Bettina, ever the pragmatist, shared her own meager rations of biscuits and water before continuing her journey. After days of crawling south, sleeping in her car, and living on her nerves, she finally made it to the port city of Bordeaux, which had become the chaotic temporary capital of a defeated France. The city was a maelstrom of terrified refugees, defeated soldiers, and desperate officials, all scrambling for passage on the few ships left that were sailing for the safety of England or America. It was a scene of utter desperation. Bettina, using every ounce of her charm, her connections, and her sheer stubborn will, managed to secure a place on one of the very last cargo ships bound for the United States. As the ship pulled out of the harbor, she stood on the crowded deck and watched the coast of France, the country that had become her home, recede into the mist. She had escaped with her life, but she was now a refugee, a professional exile, her heart and her career left behind in an occupied city. Bettina arrived back in New York to a country that was not yet at war, but was watching the events in Europe with a growing sense of alarm. She returned to her old desk at American Vogue, a strange and difficult homecoming. She was welcomed as a hero who had escaped the fall of Paris, but professionally, she found herself in a frustrating state of limbo. She was Vogue's greatest expert on Parisian fashion, but for the American market, Parisian fashion had ceased to exist. The city of couture was silenced, cut off behind enemy lines. The vital creative connection that had fueled the fashion industry for a century had been severed. For the first time in its history, the American fashion industry was forced to stand on its own, and a new, distinctly American style began to emerge. It was a style born of necessity, practical, pragmatic, and inventive. Designers like Claire McCardell, Norman Norell, and Tina Leeser began creating clothes for the modern, active American woman. It was the birth of American sportswear, a fashion built on clean lines, comfortable fabrics, and a sense of easy, unpretentious elegance. Bettina, ever the professional, covered this new movement for Vogue, but her heart wasn't in it. Her expertise, her passion, her soul remained in Paris. It was during these frustrating years of exile that her great rival, Diana Vreeland, truly exploded onto the scene and consolidated her power. While Bettina was professionally adrift, Vreeland was in her absolute element. The war, which had created a creative vacuum for so many, was a golden opportunity for a fantasist like her. She didn't need the inspiration of the Paris collections. Her inspiration sprang, fully formed, from the exotic, bizarre, and utterly original landscape of her own imagination. As the legendary fashion editor of the rival magazine Harper's Bazaar, under the brilliant leadership of Carmel Snow, Vreeland's influence became immense. She was not just showing clothes, she was creating worlds. Her famous and often satirized "Why Don't You" column was a perfect distillation of her philosophy. "Why don't you," she would write, "rinse your blonde child's hair in dead champagne to keep it gold, as they do in France?" Or, "Why don't you wear violet velvet mittens with everything?" It was absurd. It was impractical. It was utterly disconnected from the realities of wartime life. And it was exactly what a public starved for glamour wanted to read. Her fashion pages were even more revolutionary. She transformed fashion photography from simple documentation into a form of high theatrical art. She was one of the first to champion the photographer Richard Avedon. Together they created iconic narrative-driven images that were unlike anything seen before. She sent models to pose with circus elephants. She had them leaping across puddles in couture gowns. She put them in surreal, dreamlike landscapes. She famously declared that her job was to give them what they never knew they wanted. While Bettina Ballard represented the Vogue ideal of attainable, intelligent elegance, Diana Vreeland was peddling the dream of impossible, extravagant fantasy. She was not a journalist. She was a personality, a performance artist, a high priestess of chic. And in the grim, uncertain years of the war, her brand of escapism was infinitely more potent. She was becoming a legend. Bettina, from her desk at Vogue, watched Vreeland's spectacular ascent with a complex mixture of emotions. As a professional, she could not deny Vreeland's brilliant original talent, but personally, it must have been galling. While Vreeland was busy reinventing the very idea of a fashion magazine, Bettina was writing captions for sensible American-made coats, biding her time, waiting, and dreaming of the day she could return to her beloved, silenced Paris. For 4 long years she waited. She kept in touch with her friends in the French fashion world through a trickle of censored letters and clandestine messages. She heard stories of their struggle and their courage under the occupation, and she held on to the belief that the spirit of Paris and its unshakable dedication to the art of elegance would survive. In August 1944, the news the world had been waiting for finally came. Paris was free. It was a moment of pure, ecstatic joy. For Bettina, it was a deeply personal and profound moment of relief. And almost as soon as the last German tank had rumbled out of the city, she was on a mission. Condé Nast and Edna Woolman Chase gave her the assignment she had been dreaming of for 4 years. She was to be one of the very first American journalists to return to the liberated capital. She was flown to Paris on a rattling, unheated military transport plane, a stark contrast to the luxurious ocean liner she had traveled on before the war. Her mission was one of profound cultural and commercial importance: to assess the state of the French couture industry, to reconnect with the designers who had survived the dark years of occupation, to report back on what was left of the world's most important creative industry, and, if possible, to help resurrect it. The Paris she returned to was a city of ghosts and shadows. It was a city of breathtaking beauty, but it was also a city that was starving, freezing, and deeply traumatized by 4 years of Nazi rule. The physical and psychological scars were everywhere, but beneath the grim surface, a fragile, defiant, and desperately needed sense of hope was beginning to bloom. Bettina Ballard, after 4 long years in the wilderness, was home, and her great work, the work that would define her career and place her on the throne as the Queen of Paris, was about to begin. When we last saw Bettina Ballard, she was on a military transport plane, flying back to a newly liberated Paris after 4 long years of exile. She was returning not as a refugee, but as a cultural emissary, tasked by Vogue with a mission that was both daunting and historic: to help resurrect the city's legendary fashion industry from the ashes of war. She was returning to a city that had been her home, but it was a city she barely recognized, a place of ghosts and shadows, a kingdom whose throne was empty. The Paris that Bettina returned to in the autumn of 1944 was a city caught between ecstasy and agony. The joy of liberation was a palpable, intoxicating force in the streets, a citywide celebration of survival. But beneath this euphoric surface was the grim reality of a city on the brink of collapse. The infrastructure was shattered. The winter of 1944 to 45, which would become known as the Turnip Winter, was one of the coldest in memory. There was no coal, no electricity for hours at a time, and most critically, no food. The daily reality for most Parisians was a desperate, gnawing struggle for survival. Bettina, in her memoir, paints a vivid, unsentimental picture of this time. She lived in a room at the Ritz Hotel, a place of legendary luxury that was now a freezing, unheated shell, occupied by journalists and military officers. She describes waking up in the morning to find the water in her glass frozen solid, and of writing her dispatches to New York bundled in every piece of clothing she owned. Getting around the city was a daily challenge, with no taxis and almost no private cars. She, like everyone else, walked for miles or rode a bicycle through the cold, dark streets. The psychological scars of the occupation were even deeper than the physical ones. It was a time of bitter recriminations. the period of the epuration or the purge, where those who had collaborated with the Nazis were hunted down and punished. Women accused of collaboration horizontale, of sleeping with German soldiers, had their heads shaved and were paraded through the streets in acts of public shaming. The city was a tinderbox of suspicion and score settling. It was into this bleak, challenging, and morally complex environment that Bettina had to try and resurrect an industry built on the seemingly frivolous concepts of beauty and luxury. Her first task was to find her friends, the great couturiers, and assess the state of their art. It was a series of reunions filled with both joy and sorrow. She found them all physically depleted, their workrooms empty, their precious stocks of fabric long gone. But their creative spirits, though battered, were not broken. And together, in an extraordinary act of collective will, the Parisian creative community was about to produce its first great post-war miracle, a project that would signal to the world that the heart of Paris was still beating. It was a project that was perfectly suited to a world of scarcity, a masterpiece in miniature, the Théâtre de la Mode. The Théâtre de la Mode, or the Theater of Fashion, was one of the most remarkable and moving artistic endeavors of the 20th century. In a city with no resources, the idea of staging a full-scale couture show was impossible. So Lucien Lelong, the brilliant head of the Chambre syndicale de la couture, who had so bravely protected the industry during the war, conceived of a radical idea. He proposed that all the great couture houses create a miniature collection, perfectly scaled down to fit 1/3 life-size wire mannequins. These miniature creations would then be displayed in elaborate, fantastical sets created by the city's greatest artists and designers. It was an act of pure, defiant creativity. The entire artistic community of Paris threw itself into the project. The great couturiers, 60 of them, including Balenciaga, Schiaparelli, Lelong, and a rising star named Pierre Balmain, designed and created over 130 exquisite, doll-sized outfits. They used precious scraps of fabric they had hidden during the war, their skilled seamstresses painstakingly recreating every tiny button, every perfect pleat. The jewelers of the Place Vendôme, Cartier and Van Cleef and Arpels, crafted miniature diamond necklaces and ruby brooches. The city's finest hairdressers created elaborate tiny coiffures, and artists like Jean Cocteau and Christian Berard designed the magical surrealist sets in which the mannequins would be displayed. The result was an enchanting miniature world of impossible elegance, a testament to the enduring power of Parisian craftsmanship and imagination. The exhibition opened at the Louvre in March 1945 to sensational acclaim. Thousands of Parisians, starved for beauty and a reminder of their city's former glory, lined up for hours to see it. Bettina Ballard was the exhibition's greatest champion for the outside world. She understood its profound symbolism immediately. This was not about dolls' clothes. This was a statement. It was Paris announcing with wit and style that it was back in business. Her impassioned, detailed dispatches to Vogue, along with the beautiful photographs she commissioned, were instrumental in spreading the news. The Théâtre de la Mode went on a triumphant world tour, raising huge sums for war relief and, more importantly, reminding everyone that while other cities might produce clothes, only Paris could produce magic. For Bettina, it was the first hopeful sign that the world she had loved was not dead, but was merely waiting for its moment of rebirth. In the years that followed the war, as Paris slowly regained its footing, Bettina Ballard's power and influence grew to its absolute zenith. The city was once again the undisputed fashion capital, and she, as the chief editor of Paris Vogue, was its most important foreign ambassador. This was her golden age. She was, without question, the Queen of Paris. Her power stemmed from her unique position as the essential bridge between the fragile, rebuilding Paris couture and the immensely wealthy and hungry American market. American department store buyers, from behemoths like Neiman Marcus, Bergdorf Goodman, and Saks Fifth Avenue, as well as the powerful editors of the American fashion press, all relied on her judgment. Her taste, her knowledge, and her access were unparalleled. Before they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on a new collection, their first stop was often a quiet lunch with Bettina to get her assessment. A nod of approval from her could guarantee a designer's success. A subtle shake of the head could spell their doom. Her apartment on the Quai Voltaire became the unofficial nerve center of the entire industry. Her famous lunches were the most sought-after invitation in Paris. They were not large, lavish affairs, but small, intimate gatherings where the real business of fashion was conducted. At her table, a young, nervous designer might find himself seated next to the most powerful buyer from New York, with Bettina gently guiding the conversation, forging the connections that would shape the future of fashion. But the true source of her power was the deep, genuine personal relationships she cultivated with the designers themselves. She was their confidant, their advocate, and often their friend. This was particularly true with the two towering geniuses who would dominate the post-war era, Christian Dior and Cristobal Balenciaga. Her friendship with the reclusive Balenciaga, which had begun before the war, deepened into a bond of profound mutual respect. He continued to grant her access that he gave to almost no other journalist. She understood his almost monastic dedication to the purity of his craft, his disdain for trends and publicity. She, in turn, wrote about his work with an intelligence and a reverence that no other editor could match. She was one of the few who truly understood that he was not just a designer, he was an architect, a sculptor who worked in cloth. And then there was Dior. In February of 1947, Christian Dior, a quiet, shy, and deeply superstitious man in his 40s, presented his very first collection under his own name. Bettina was there, in the crowded, overheated, and deliriously excited salon on the Avenue Montaigne. What she saw that day was not just a collection. It was a cultural explosion, a moment that would forever divide fashion history into before and after. In a world still defined by the drab, utilitarian, and fabric-ration styles of the war, Dior sent out a collection of breathtaking, almost decadent femininity. His models, with their soft, sloping shoulders, their tiny, wasp-waisted jackets, and their vast, swirling mid-calf skirts, made with yards and yards of luxurious fabric, were a vision from another world. This was the legendary new look. It was a complete and total rejection of the past decade. It was romantic, extravagant, and wildly optimistic. It was the sartorial equivalent of the liberation. Bettina, with her unerring instinct, understood its revolutionary importance instantly. While some in the audience were shocked by its extravagance, she saw its genius. This was the new beginning that Paris and the world had been yearning for. She became the new look's most powerful and articulate champion. Her ecstatic reports in Vogue, combined with the iconic photographs she commissioned, helped to make Christian Dior a global superstar overnight. He was eternally grateful, and the two forged a close and deeply affectionate friendship. He trusted her judgment implicitly, often inviting her for private previews of his collections before anyone else, eagerly awaiting her verdict. In these golden years, Bettina Ballard was at the absolute height of her powers. Her influence was so profound that in the narrative of post-war fashion, she could rightly be seen as the reigning queen of Paris. But even as she reigned supreme in her Parisian kingdom, a rival power was consolidating its forces across the Atlantic. The world was beginning to change in ways she couldn't or wouldn't embrace, and the theatrical, fantastical, and utterly unstoppable vision of Diana Vreeland, which had been a distant rumble at Harper's Bazaar, was about to become a direct and existential threat. The world of the 1950s was a world in transition. The post-war recovery gave way to a new era of consumerism, prosperity, and mass media. The very nature of fashion was beginning to change. The rarefied, hermetically sealed world of haute couture, which was Bettina's domain, was starting to lose its absolute authority. A new, vibrant, ready-to-wear industry was on the rise, particularly in America and later in Italy. Fashion was becoming faster, more accessible, more democratic, and the way fashion was presented was changing too. The quiet, elegant, and beautifully lit studio photographs that had been the hallmark of Vogue for decades were beginning to look a little static, a little staid. At Harper's Bazaar, Diana Vreeland and the photographer Richard Avedon were creating a new visual language. Their fashion stories were dynamic, narrative-driven, and shot on location. They created a sense of movement, of energy, of life. Vreeland's vision of fashion was not about a woman standing elegantly in a room. It was about a woman having an adventure. Bettina, a classicist at heart, viewed these developments with a certain skepticism. She believed in the primacy of the clothes themselves, not in the theatricality of their presentation. She found Vreeland's work to be exciting, but also often absurd, and in her view, vulgar. It was a clash of fundamental philosophies. For Bettina, the goal was to present the designer's creation with intelligence and respect. For Vreeland, the designer's dress was merely the starting point, the first brushstroke in a much grander, more personal, and more fantastical painting. For years, this philosophical battle was fought from across the trenches of rival publications. But a shift was happening within Vogue itself. A new editorial director, a man named Alexander Liberman, had taken the creative reins. Liberman, a brilliant and forward-thinking artist, admired Vreeland's dynamism and her incredible eye. The powers that be in the New York office began to gently pressure Bettina and the Paris team to be more exciting, more dramatic, more Vreeland. Bettina resisted. She was a woman of deep artistic integrity, and she refused to compromise her standards or her belief in a certain kind of timeless elegance. But she was fighting against the tide of history. The world was getting louder, faster, and more obsessed with personality. The quiet, authoritative voice of good taste was beginning to be drowned out by the much more exciting shriek of pizzazz. The first major tremor that signaled the ground was shifting beneath her throne came in 1957, with the sudden, shocking death of Christian Dior from a heart attack. It was a devastating personal blow for Bettina, but it was also a professional one. She had lost not just a dear friend, but her most powerful ally in the couture world. It was the end of the new look era, the end of the golden age she had helped to create. The world of fashion was poised for another revolution, the youthquake of the 1960s, a revolution for which she was temperamentally and philosophically unprepared. The final fatal blow to her reign came in 1962. In a move that sent shockwaves through the entire publishing industry, Diana Vreeland, after 25 legendary years at Harper's Bazaar, was hired away by Vogue. Bettina received the news via a cool, formal cable from the New York office. The rival queen was no longer at a competing court. The hurricane was now inside the palace. The battle for the soul of Vogue and for the future of fashion was about to be joined. And for Bettina Ballard, the quiet, elegant queen of Paris, it was a battle she was destined to lose. Diana Vreeland's arrival at Vogue in 1962 signaled the beginning of the end for Bettina Ballard's vision of fashion. It was not an immediate ousting, but the start of a gradual marginalization. For the next several years, her classical influence waned as Vreeland's theatrical revolution took hold, ultimately leading to Bettina's quiet retirement. Vreeland did not just arrive at Vogue, she descended upon it. She was appointed associate editor, but it was clear from her first day that she was the new spiritual and creative center of the magazine. She was a whirlwind of energy, a geyser of bizarre and brilliant ideas. The staid, respectable, and somewhat predictable corridors of the Vogue offices were suddenly filled with her booming, theatrical pronouncements. "Pink is the navy blue of India," she would declare. "The eye has to travel," she would command. She didn't just edit the magazine, she inhabited it. She remade it in her own image. The fundamental clash between her vision and Bettina's was immediately apparent in the magazine's pages. Bettina, from her perch in Paris, continued to send her impeccably written, intelligent, and insightful reports on the haute couture collections. She wrote with reverence about the perfect architectural cut of a Balenciaga coat, the subtle genius of a Givenchy neckline. Her pages were a masterclass in a certain kind of quiet, considered elegance. They were beautiful, informative, and aimed at a sophisticated, mature woman who appreciated quality and timeless style. Meanwhile, in New York, Vreeland was staging a revolution. She wasn't interested in simply reporting on clothes. She was interested in creating myths. Her fashion editorials became legendary, multi-page epics of pure, unadulterated fantasy. She sent the model Verushka to Japan to be photographed by Richard Avedon against the backdrop of a snow-covered Mount Fuji, not to show a coat, but to evoke a feeling. She famously ordered a photographer to shoot a multi-million-dollar collection of jewels on a model whose face was completely obscured by a curtain of hair, because, as she declared, the jewels were the star. It was a fundamental battle of philosophies, fought with photographs and captions. Bettina believed the role of a fashion editor was to serve the designer, to present their creation with intelligence and clarity. Vreeland believed the designer's dress was merely a prop, a single element in her own, much grander theatrical production. For Bettina, the woman wore the dress. For Vreeland, the dress was part of a dream, and the woman was a character within it. This clash was taking place against the backdrop of a world that was changing at lightning speed. The 1960s had arrived, and with them, the youthquake. A new generation, the first to grow up after the war, was rejecting the staid, formal elegance of their parents. The new center of the fashion universe was no longer the hallowed couture salons of Paris, but the vibrant, energetic, and rebellious streets of swinging London. The new idols were not the anonymous mannequin-like couture models, but girls with personality like the aristocratic Jean Shrimpton and the working-class wide-eyed Twiggy. The new designers, like Mary Quant, were making clothes that were young, fun, and disposable. This new world was Diana Vreeland's natural territory. She understood its energy, its irreverence, its obsession with personality, instinctively. She immediately put these new models on the cover of Vogue. She championed the new edgy photographers. She filled the magazine's pages with the sound and the fury of the new generation. She made Vogue exciting, unpredictable, and essential reading for anyone who wanted to be part of the cultural conversation. Bettina, a woman whose entire career had been built on the ideal of timeless adult elegance, was utterly bewildered by this new world. She looked at the mini skirts, the white lipstick, and the loud pop art prints with a kind of aristocratic disdain. In her memoir, she writes about this period with a palpable sense of alienation. She saw it as a celebration of the vulgar, the cheap, and the ephemeral. She, who had been friends with the great masters of the 20th century, could not bring herself to take this new youth fashion seriously. She was a classicist in a revolutionary, romantic era, and her worldview, once the very definition of good taste, was now beginning to look old-fashioned, out of touch and irrelevant. The decline of Bettina's power at Vogue was not a sudden dramatic event. There was no single confrontation, no formal dismissal. It was a long, slow, and deeply painful process. A death by 1,000 cuts. A quiet, brutal sidelining that was all the more humiliating for being so gradual. Her dispatches from Paris, once the lead stories that set the tone for an entire issue, began to be edited down, their word counts slashed. Her carefully crafted layouts would be altered in New York, her choice of photographs overridden. Then her stories started to be pushed further and further back in the magazine, relegated to a few pages near the advertisements, while Vreeland's spectacular multi-page fantasies dominated the front of the book. The photographers she had worked with for years, men like Henry Clark and Cecil Beaton, found their assignments from Paris dwindling. The real action, the big budgets, and the creative freedom were now in New York with Vreeland. She tried to fight back, to defend her vision of what Vogue should be. She would send long, eloquent cables to the head office, arguing for the importance of classic couture, for a standard of quality she saw rapidly disappearing. But she was a lone voice crying in the wilderness. The magazine and the world was sprinting in Vreeland's direction. The emotional toll on this proud, private, and deeply professional woman was immense. It was a profound and public invalidation of her life's work. Her taste, which had been her identity, her greatest asset, was now being implicitly and sometimes explicitly dismissed as old-fashioned. To her, it felt like a betrayal not just by her colleagues, but by the very culture she had helped to shape. The final symbolic blow came not from Vogue, but from her oldest and dearest friend in fashion. In 1968, the great Cristobal Balenciaga, the master, the man Bettina considered the only true genius of couture, abruptly announced he was closing his house and retiring. He was disgusted with the new direction of fashion, the emphasis on ready-to-wear, and the decline of the craftsmanship he held sacred. His famous final declaration was a lament that resonated deeply with Bettina. There is no one left to dress. It was the end of an era. The world that she had understood, the world of pure, uncompromising artistry, was gone. Her greatest champion had laid down his scissors. For Bettina, there was nothing left to fight for. Shortly after Balenciaga's retirement, after more than 30 years, as one of its most important and influential voices, Bettina Ballard quietly retired from Vogue. After a lifetime lived at the center of the storm, Bettina retreated into a quiet, private life. She had left Vogue, but the world she had chronicled for so long was a part of her very soul, and she set about her final, and perhaps most important, creative act. She decided to write her own story. Her memoir, In My Fashion, was published in 1960. It's crucial to understand the timing. She wrote it while still a powerful figure at Vogue, but as a nostalgic and witty love letter to a world of elegance she could already sense was vanishing. It was a testament to the golden age of haute couture, published just before the revolutionary cultural shifts of the 1960s and the arrival of Diana Vreeland at Vogue would change the landscape forever. It is not a bitter, score-settling memoir. It is a brilliant, witty, and deeply nostalgic love letter to a world of elegance, craftsmanship, and integrity that she could already sense was vanishing forever. It is the definitive account of the golden age of haute couture, told from the ultimate insider's perspective. Reading it, is like being invited to the most exclusive lunch party in the world. Bettina writes with a sharp, observant, and often bitingly funny eye about the brilliant, difficult, and eccentric characters who populated her world. She gives us a priceless first-hand portrait of Chanel's fierce ambition, of Schiaparelli's artistic genius, of Dior's gentle, superstitious nature, and her writing about her great hero, Balenciaga, is the most insightful and respectful account of the reclusive master ever written. But the most compelling character in the book is Bettina herself. Her voice is that of a highly intelligent, self-aware, and deeply civilized woman, navigating a world of immense egos and breathtaking creativity. The book is her monument, her testament, her final definitive statement on what she believed fashion and a life of style should be. It was her attempt to record the values of her world before they were swept away by the tide of the new. Bettina Ballard lived out her final years with grace and dignity, primarily in New York. She died in 1974 at the age of 69, a quiet end to a life that had been anything but. She was a woman of immense substance, taste, and quiet courage. She was the last true queen of a certain kind of Paris, a certain kind of fashion, a certain kind of elegance that the world would never see again. So what is the lasting legacy of Bettina Ballard, the forgotten queen of Paris? In the loud, chaotic, and often amnesiac world of fashion, her name is not as instantly recognizable as that of her great rival. Vreeland, with her theatricality, her larger-than-life personality, and her endless quotable pronouncements, was a figure perfectly made for the modern media age. Her legacy is spectacular, undeniable, and continues to inspire designers and editors to this day. But Bettina's legacy is quieter, more subtle, and for those who look closely, just as profound. She was the ultimate insider's insider, a woman whose influence was felt not in grand public gestures, but in the quiet, consistent championing of true quality and timeless style. In an industry that is so often about shouting, she was a voice of intelligent, considered prose. She was the guardian of a certain kind of elegance, a belief that fashion should be about more than just fantasy. It should be about a deep and respectful understanding of a woman's life, of the cut of a sleeve, of the fall of a fabric. She was the crucial bridge between the artistic genius of the Paris couture houses and the vast commercial power of the American market. Without her quiet diplomacy and her unerring eye, the post-war fashion landscape would have looked very different. Her story is also a poignant and deeply human one. It is a reminder that, in any field, the relentless, insatiable march of the new often pushes aside the valuable and the beautiful from the past. It's a cautionary tale about the brutal, unsentimental nature of the fashion industry, a world that is in a constant state of devouring its own. Bettina represents a kind of intellectual adult elegance that was swept away by the louder, more immediate, and more theatrical forces of modern celebrity culture. But ultimately, the story of Bettina Ballard is not a tragedy. It is the story of a woman who, through intelligence, hard work, and an unshakable sense of her own taste, carved out a life of immense influence and purpose. She may have lost the public battle for legendary status to the force of nature that was Diana Vreeland, but it wasn't a failure of her talent. It was a reflection of a changing world. She was a woman of substance in a world that was falling in love with spectacle. And substance, like a perfectly cut Balenciaga coat, has a quiet, enduring power of its own. Her life and her work are an elegant testament to the power of good taste, a reminder that true style is not about the noise you make, but about the quiet, confident, and intelligent choices that last forever.